Imagine an entire nation pushed to the edge, its soldiers starving, exhausted, and buried alive in a war that had no end. By 1917, the First World War had transformed Europe into a wasteland. Front lines that once moved quickly were now frozen in a nightmare of trenches, mud, and unending death. Among the worst hit was France, a nation that had poured its heart, soul, and millions of lives into a war that refused to break. For years, French soldiers had survived inside trenches that looked less like battlefields and more like graves waiting to be filled. They suffered through ice-cold nights, rats crawling over their boots, diseases spreading like wildfire, and shell fire that never stopped long enough for them to sleep without fear. Their morale was crumbling, and the country itself was reaching the point of emotional and human exhaustion. All it would take was one more failed battle to push the entire army past its breaking point. By 1917, the Western Front had turned into a brutal stalemate stretching hundreds of kilometers. Both sides dug deep defensive lines protected by barbed wire, machine guns, and concrete bunkers. Every year, commanders promised their soldiers that a decisive offensive was coming, one final push that would end the suffering. Every year, thousands followed orders and climbed out of the trenches into machine gun fire. And every year, almost none returned. French soldiers began calling the front line the slaughterhouse. Still, military leaders insisted victory was just one more attack away. In April 1917, General Robert Nivelle arrived with bold promises. He claimed he had developed a strategy that would break the German lines in just 48 hours. His plan relied on a massive artillery bombardment followed by a fast infantry advance at the Chemin de Dames Ridge. He told his government, his officers, and his soldiers that this offensive would end the war. Many doubted him. His officers quietly warned that the plan was reckless and overly optimistic. But France, desperate for victory, approved it anyway. What Nivelle didn't know was that the Germans were already prepared. They had intercepted French communications and heavily reinforced their defenses. When the French launched the Chemin de Dames offensive on April 16, 1917, nearly 850,000 men charged forward into machine gun fire, rain, and mud. German troops waited on higher ground, protected by the powerful Hindenburg Line, and unleashed devastating fire. Within a single day, 40,000 French soldiers were killed or wounded. And despite his earlier promise, Nivelle did not stop after 48 hours. He continued the attack for 18 days. Each day, another 10,000 men fell. When the offensive finally ended, France had gained only a few kilometers of useless ground. It was a disaster, one of the worst in French military history. Morale collapsed instantly. Soldiers cursed Nivelle as a murderer. He was removed from command, but the damage was irreversible. The French army had reached its limit. The men who had endured years of horror were now exhausted, furious, and betrayed. They began to refuse orders, not in an organized revolution, but in a desperate plea for survival. Small groups initially refused to march back to the front. Then entire units refused to return from rest areas. They shouted, "We've had enough!" Soldiers boarded trains trying to go home, only to be stopped by military police. Most weren't violent. They simply refused to keep fighting in battles that accomplished nothing. Within weeks, the unrest had spread across 30 to 40,000 soldiers belonging to as many as 16 Army Corps. France suddenly faced a terrifying reality, a frontline army that no longer trusted its leaders. For the French government, it felt like the country was one mistake away from collapsing, just as Russia had earlier that year. But unlike the Russian Revolution, France's soldiers were not trying to destroy their government. They didn't want surrender. They didn't want power. They wanted something deeply human. They wanted to live. Their demands were surprisingly modest: end the pointless offensives, improve food and conditions, grant regular leave, and respect the value of human life. They were still willing to defend France. They simply refused to die for strategies that achieved nothing. This was not a political rebellion. It was the cry of men who had reached their emotional and physical limit. When General Philippe Pétain took command, he understood the gravity of the moment. He realized punishment alone wouldn't fix an army on the edge of collapse. Yet discipline couldn't be ignored either. Thousands of mutineers were arrested, 22,000 found guilty, and several hundred sentenced to death, though only around 26 to 55 executions were carried out. Then Pétain changed course. He traveled across the front, listened to the men, improved food supplies, increased rest periods, and guaranteed regular leave. Most importantly, He stopped all large-scale offensives until the army had recovered. The soldiers didn't cheer, but they listened. Slowly, discipline returned. The French army didn't collapse. The front held. And when the Germans launched their final attacks in 1918, those same exhausted soldiers stood their ground and helped win the war. After the war, France hid the story of the 1917 mutinies, fearing it would be seen as shame. But historians now see it differently, not as betrayal, but as an act of courage. These soldiers weren't cowards. They were human beings pushed to the limits of endurance, who finally said no to meaningless death. Their refusal forced military leaders to confront the reality of modern warfare and helped save what remained of France's army. When history remembers them, it isn't for their defiance, but for their humanity. If you want deeper stories like this, stories of leadership, failure, strategy, and the political decisions that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe to Youth in Politics. Our mission is to bring history, geopolitics, and global conflicts to life in a way that's powerful, honest, and impossible to ignore. Stay informed, stay curious, and remember, politics isn't just about today, it's about understanding how we got here.